Hello and welcome to this in English tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at giving advice. Now, advice is a suggestion I give to somebody concerning what I think they should or shouldn't do. We can say what, in our opinion, is advisable or necessary on a scale which shows how much choice we have. So if we look at a continuum, on the left-hand side we have more choice, on the right-hand side we have less choice. When we give people advice, when we formulate that message can come to them and leave them more or less choice in the advice that we are giving them. So let's have a look at some of the language we use to give more advice, or rather more choice or less choice. The word should or the phrase ought to. Let's have a look at that. What I think I or you should do. For example, maybe I should see a doctor. Maybe you should see a doctor. What I think I or you ought to do. Maybe I ought to see a doctor. Maybe you ought to see a doctor. Now, if we look at our continuum of choice, we'll see that using should or ought to gives the recipient of the advice a lot of choice. Should and ought to are the same. Both allow a degree of choice to act or not on the advice. What about had better? Had better suggests less choice and greater urgency than should or ought to. For example, I had better see a doctor. It is urgent. If we look at that on our continuum, then the phrase had better gives us less choice in the advice. What about have to or must? Have to or must suggests very little choice, and it is stronger than should, ought to, and had better. For example, you have to or must see a doctor. You don't have any choice. I have to or must see a doctor. I'm going to. If we look at our continuum once again, one can see that using have to and must gives the recipient of the advice, even if the recipient is yourself, of course you can give yourself advice, very little choice. So let's have a look at that continuum again. On the left, we have more choice. On the right, we have less choice. What are some of the words that we use to indicate these choices? On the more choice side, we use, as we saw earlier, should. We say to somebody they should do something. Well, that gives them a lot of choice as to whether they do it or not. Ought to, maybe a little less choice. Had better. Now there's a sense of urgency. Have to, well, that's must. And then, of course, must, the least choice. So there's a range of language you can use to indicate more or less choice in English. Other words that we could use would be words like recommend on the left-hand end of our continuum, encourage, strongly advise, and need to. Now, what about advice not taken? So we're looking back now into the past and looking at advice that was given but not taken. We can express failure to act on advice with should have or ought to have. I should have seen a doctor, but I didn't. I ought to have seen a doctor, but I didn't. We can use should have and ought to have to express failure to act on advice. What about advice that was taken? We can express advice that was taken by using had to. I cut my finger this morning and I had to see a doctor, and I did. We can say that we follow advice that was given by using had to. Now, deduction. What is deduction? It's when I see something has happened and I think to myself, why did that happen? And I join dots together to ascertain why something happened. We call that deduction. For example, Michael is trying to get a job. He must have seen his graduate advisor. That is what I conclude from his behavior. I see Michael is trying to get a job, so I join the dots as to why it is that Michael is trying to get a job, and I think to myself, it must have been because he saw his graduate advisor and his advisor said to him, you must get a job. He deduced that. Second example, the man is sweating and out of breath. He must have been running in the hot weather. I deduce that. It's a deduction that I make. I see the man sweating and he's out of breath. I deduce that he must have been running in the hot weather. Must have is used here to express past deduction or conclusion. Well, I hope you found that short tutorial helpful. You can find us on Facebook, you can find us on YouTube, and you can find us also on the internet at www.inenglishacademy.com.